Number 16, which of the following is going to reconcile the counterexample with the general rule given? So we're going to be trying to solve a discrepancy here. We're going to be reading two statements that seem to go against each other, and we have to figure out how to make it all make sense. So what are these two statements that go against each other? So on the one hand, says the paragraph, historians have found that significant intellectual advances tend to happen in places that have a stable political system. But on the other hand, these same historians acknowledge that in ancient Athens, Plato and Aristotle made great intellectual progress even though there was great political unrest, the opposite of a stable political system. So in other words, on the one hand, we have this general rule, but on the other hand, we have this major outlier to that general rule. The general rule says that in general, great intellectual advances happen in places and times that are stable politically. So the question is, how then was Athens able to break this rule so much? Athens had great political and social unrest, and yet Plato and Aristotle were able to make such great intellectual progress. So the question is, how was that able to be true? That's essentially the question we're trying to answer is why were Plato and Aristotle able to make such great intellectual progress even though they were living in a place and time with great political unrest, which breaks the general rule. So let's look for something that's going to answer that question in the answer choices. A tells us about some things that have happened since ancient Athens. Since then, the political systems that have emerged since that time of Plato and Aristotle have in some ways been different from the political system that was in ancient Athens. Okay, great. I don't see how that really helps us out here because we're still left wondering, we're still left with the same question we started with, which is, okay, fine, things have changed since then, I get it. But at that time, there was great political unrest, according to the paragraph. How were these people able to make such intellectual progress? Telling me that things changed since then in the future, that is not going to help us answer the question. B tells us that the citizens who lived in ancient Athens generally held people who were intellectually accomplished in high esteem. They looked up to those people. Okay, fine, that's good. That's good for those people, but it doesn't answer the question of how they were able to make such intellectual progress, right? B tells us that once they made that progress, they were generally well respected, but that doesn't answer the question of how they were able to make that progress to begin with, because according to the paragraph, social and political unrest, generally speaking, does not allow for great intellectual progress to be made, right? So just telling me that those people who were very accomplished intellectually, the people who had made progress intellectually, in other words, telling me that they were well respected, doesn't answer the question of how they were able to make that progress in the first place, right? Especially when we know from the paragraph that places where there's a lot of political unrest, that tends to be not the places where people make this progress. So B tells me, well, they were well respected once they made the progress. Once they became accomplished intellectually, they were well respected. Okay, but how did they become accomplished intellectually? How did they make that intellectual progress to begin with? So B does not answer the question that we're trying to answer. C gives us some new information. It tells us that financial support for intellectual endeavors tends to be not available in unstable political environments. Okay, so that's consistent with what we've read so far. In fact, maybe that's a reason. Maybe that's a reason why in unstable political environments we don't have successful intellectual endeavors, because there's no financial support for them. Okay, says C so far. But in ancient Athens was different. Such support was actually provided directly from rich citizens. So C tells us a difference between Athens and other unstable political systems. That's exactly what we're looking for, because we're trying to figure out, why was Athens an outlier? In very simple terms, that's the question we're trying to answer with these answer choices. We're trying to look for the one that answers, why was Athens an outlier? Athens was unstable politically, which means we should expect not a lot of intellectual progress. Why was it different? C says, here's why it's different. Here's why ancient Athens was different. Because even though most of the time in unstable political systems you don't have financial support for intellectual endeavors, in Athens you did. So here's a reason why Athens had a leg up over other unstable political systems in the arena of making intellectual progress. That's all we're looking for. It's exactly what we're looking for. It's telling us why Athens would be better, why we would expect more intellectual progress from Athens as compared to other unstable political environments. C literally tells us that. It answers the question we're looking for, which means it's the right answer. So D tells us that once you have significant intellectual progress, D tells us that sometimes, though not always, is going to lead to stability in the political environment. Okay, but that doesn't tell us how in the first place Athens was able to have this intellectual progress, right? D says once you have the intellectual progress, that's going to lead to stability. Okay, but according to the paragraph, the progress only happens if there's stability to begin with for the most part. So we're still left wondering, how was Athens able to so much break this rule? Why was Athens such an outlier? D has nothing to do with Athens. It's certainly not answering the question of why Athens was able to break the mold in this respect, so it's not going to be the right answer. E says that Plato and Aristotle weren't acting alone. In fact, there were many other thinkers that also contributed to the intellectual achievements of ancient Athens. Okay, but we're still left with the same question we began with, which is, how were all these intellectual heroes able to make such progress, right? We were questioning, how were Plato and Aristotle able to make such great intellectual progress, right? And E says, well, there were a lot of other thinkers that contributed as well. Okay, well, I'm still left with the same question. How were they able to make progress too, right? Just telling me that there were other thinkers doesn't answer the question, because the question was very specific. It said, in spite of the fact that we have this general rule that when there's political unrest, there's not a lot of intellectual progress, how was it that Plato and Aristotle were able to break that rule? And E says other thinkers contributed. Okay, well, now I have the same question, but amplified, because I have the same question about those other thinkers too. How was all this able to happen? E says there were other thinkers too that were progressing, that were making the progress as well. Okay, but I'm still left with the question of how. How did they make this progress, and why did they make all this progress in an era and a place when there was such political unrest, even though most of the time that wouldn't have been the case? So I'm left with the same question that I started with after reading E, which means it's not going to help us out. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.